And we're going to our next topic. If you had a flyer that had the schedule, I reversed them. I did the Protestant Reformation Revolt first. And now I'm going to do, it's Christendom and the Crusades, but I'm extending it to the church versus Islam, a continuing war. So there's a lot of talk about crusades. There's a crusade to end drunk driving. There are crusades against terrorism. But the original meaning of crusade comes from the Latin word crux, or cross, C-R-U-X. And those who went on crusade were said to be taking the cross. So that's why it was called a crusade. And they were fighting for religious reasons. So, isn't a religious war a bad idea? Should we really fight for religion? Shouldn't we just all kind of get along? And weren't the Crusaders guilty of atrocities, out for wealth, unjust aggressors? Well, let's put the Crusades in historical context. And for that, we have to understand Islam. Islam was founded in the 600s by a caravan trader in Mecca, which is in Arabia. His name, as you know, was Muhammad. He claimed that Gabriel had appeared to him, the angel Gabriel, and dictated the Quran, which means recitations, dictated the Quran to him. No one in Mecca believed him at first, and they ordered his arrest because he was stirring up so much trouble. They couldn't worship their pagan gods anymore. So he had to escape from Mecca, and he went to Medina, where he had found some followers. It's a little bit, not really a lot like, but you know how Jesus went to Nazareth and they wouldn't accept him because they knew him too well? I think the people in Mecca knew Muhammad too well. People in Medina did not. But the point was, he escaped to Medina in 622, and that is year 1 of Islam. Their calendar starts with the year 622. He put together a military force. He conquered Mecca, and by his death in 632 had united all of Arabia. After his death, the people that had come into Islam, mainly because they saw it either as a chance for power or because they were threatened if they didn't, started to kind of drift away. It was very easy to become a Muslim. All you had to do was say, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. So you didn't have to go through an RCIA, rite of Islamic initiation or something like that. You didn't have to go through that. You just said this. That didn't take you very long to memorize. So it was easy to become a Muslim, and there were advantages to it. So they started to drift away. Muhammad's successor was named Abu Bakr, B-A-K-R, and he made a policy that if you left Islam, you would suffer the death penalty. So that would be a deterrent. And he had the force that Muhammad built up to enforce it. So he saved Islam. He was followed, the second successor, or caliph for successor, was named Omar, O-M-A-R, and he put into practice what Muhammad had put into the Quran, the jihad, or religious war. Muhammad taught that the world was divided into 2 parts. The abode of Islam, which was the area that accepted Islam, and the abode of war, which was everybody else. So that the jihad then was a war against everybody that had not yet accepted Islam. And the idea was to conquer the world. It's very spelled out. And people will now today say, but Muslims are nonviolent. Well, most of the Muslims you're going to meet, of course they're nonviolent. And I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about what the policies were that Muhammad laid down and what his followers put into practice. And it included taking over other territories, taking over the abode of war and turning it into the abode of Islam. So under Omar occurred what are called the Great Arab Conquest, and sent out armies to carry out those conquests. They were fired with religious zeal. They believed that they died in battle, they would go straight to paradise. It was a very sensual, materialistic paradise. They had excellent cavalry. They had their horses and their camels. And the areas that they went after, and many of them were corrupt and weak. Also, you had had heresies in these Christian areas in the east, which had weakened the Catholic faith there. So they quickly conquered Syria and Iraq, then Jerusalem. And after they took Jerusalem, by the way, they built that huge mosque called the Dome of the Rock. If you see pictures of the skyline of Jerusalem, that's what dominates it, is this Muslim mosque, the Dome of the Rock. Then they sent out armies in several different directions. One went as far as India and took over the part of India that today is known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. Another went into what is the modern-day Russia and took over all those places that I just for short call the stands, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc. Took over those, which are still Muslim today. Took over Egypt, took over Persia, went out to North Africa, took over North Africa, and then they went across the Straits of Gibraltar and invaded Spain. And in Spain, we have one of the God is good. The Spanish kingdom fell pretty quickly. The Spanish king was killed, and Spain was being overrun by the Muslims. The last survivor of the Spanish royal family was named Pelayo, P-E-L-A-Y-O. And he took his few followers, and they went up in the mountains and took over this little strip of land that the Muslims had not conquered. It was the specific place they were was called Covadonga. And they took that over, just this few of them. The Muslims said, well, let's send our men up that mountain and wipe them out too. So they sent a force up. But your cavalry is not going to be much help going up a mountain and fighting in a rugged terrain like that. And your cavalry especially not going to be much help when the Catholics are rolling boulders down the hill and timber and knocking them over the side. So the Catholics held out. The Muslims decided to try infiltration. They sent a Catholic bishop, who basically was a renegade, up to the mountain to persuade Pelayo to give up. And the Catholic bishop made the following arguments. Everybody else has given in. Why don't you? You'll get all kinds of rewards and inducements if you give in. You don't want to be the only ones that aren't that are standing out of this wave of the future. Pelayo said, have you ever heard of the parable of the mustard seed? And the bishop said, yes. And then Pelayo said, this small group here is going to be like the mustard seed. This little mountain will be the salvation of Spain. The Muslim leader said, oh, well, I'll give up. I'm sorry. The bishop gave up, went down and told the Muslim leader. So then the Muslim leader said, what are 30 barbarians perched on a rock? They will inevitably perish. So Pelayo was saying, this little mountain will be the salvation of Spain. And the Muslims are saying, what are 30 barbarians perched on a rock? They will inevitably perish. So they bypassed Pelayo, went on into France, where they were stopped by a force of Franks. And then that was kind of the end of the Great Arab Conquest. But all the places, almost every single place they had taken over in the Great Arab Conquest remains Muslim to this day. An exception is Spain. And we'll look more at Spain as we move through the history of the church versus Islam. All right. So keep those two quotes in mind. 30 barbarians perched on a rock, or will be the salvation of Spain. All right, so after the Great Arab Conquest, the Muslims kind of stopped their military activities. They were not so militant for quite a while. But then came the conversion to Islam of another group called the Seljuk Turks, S-E-L-J-U-K, the Seljuk Turks. They took over and then began ruling as the Islamic territories that are mostly the ones in the east. They refused to allow pilgrims to go to the Holy Land. And they set out to resume the conquest, which now they hope to become the Great Turk Conquest, to first conquer the Byzantine Empire, which controlled Turkey, Greece, and areas around that. And their chief city, which is the wealthiest, largest city in the world, was Constantinople. So the Seljuk Turks invaded into Byzantine territory. The Byzantine Empire was Christian, but it was schismatic. It had gone into schism in 1054, rejecting the authority of the Pope, but they still had valid sacraments and a valid priesthood, and they were strong Christians. There was a major battle. The emperor was killed, and the Byzantine army wiped out, and the Turks took over much of Turkey. So the next emperor asked the Pope for help. And he said, "We are your fellow Christians. Will you come to our aid?" The Pope was Pope Urban, and he called a council in Clermont, France, and he invited the knights of Europe to come to this council. Europe at this time was in the feudal system, and so you had these knights controlling these large landholdings, and so they came. And he explained to them, we have two things we must do. We must defend our brother Christians and not let the Turks get any farther. And we must try to regain the Holy Land. This is a land where Christ lived, the land where Christ walked. It belongs in Christian hands. And he said, the Pope said in Latin, Deus vult, or God wills it. And the knights, in great enthusiasm, they said, we want to go on this crusade. And the symbol was going to be a red cross they would sew on their sleeves. So they ran through the city of Clermont, buying up all the red cloth there was and making crosses for their sleeves. So it's great enthusiasm. Now, we have to look, this is then leading to the First Crusade. So the First Crusade, and remember there's going to be a lot of crusades, and the first one is the most important. And the First Crusade had its own special characteristic. The knights, as a group, were fighting for the glory of God and the salvation of souls. Granted, you're going to have people on any big group that are not going to have the same good motives. But as a group, the knights wanted to defend their Christian brothers and liberate the Holy Land. So they didn't, the just war because the Muslims were the aggressors. The Muslims had attacked Christian territory. They were the aggressors. They were waging aggressive war. And so it was perfectly justified to defend that territory. If the Muslims had taken over Turkey and Constantinople, you think they would have stopped there and said, that's enough. We don't need to conquer the rest of the world. Oh yes, Muhammad told us we should, but we're not going to bother. Of course not. They would have kept going, as we'll see as we look into the future history. So it was a defensive war. And then what about going into the Holy Land? Well, the Muslims had originally conquered the Holy Land. It was not theirs to start with. Muhammad was from Arabia. The Muslims took over the Holy Land. So it was justified, and they weren't treating the Christians there well, weren't even allowing them to come. So it was justified to take that action. Now, at the beginning, if they had looked at the odds, they would have felt that the Christians are going to have a really tough time at this. They didn't have one unifying leader, whereas the Muslims did. The Muslims were building off a wealthy civilization. Christianity had just emerged from the Dark Ages. The Muslims had home field advantage, so the odds were against the Christians. But what did the Christians have? For their part, they had the religious zeal. And because of all their little feudal system wars they had, they were excellent cavalry fighters, and they were pretty tough. So they start off, and they marching through Europe to get to Constantinople, where they were going to join up all the different groups coming from France, from Germany, from the different places. There were three main leaders. One was named Bohemond, Bohemon, who was a Norman, which is descendants of the Vikings. One was named Raymond, he was from France. And one was named Godfrey, and he was from the territory between France and Germany. They had a chaplain representing the Pope, Bishop Adhemar, Adhemar. There were some other people besides these crusaders who got all excited about a crusade and said, let's just go. God is with us. We can go. So a group of people had no military experience under the leadership of someone called Peter the Hermit headed off to go fight the Muslims. They really didn't know what they were doing. It was a serious mistake, and the Muslims easily beat them. But the good result of that was the Muslims weren't taking the Christians seriously. If this is all we have to fight, we're not going to worry. And so when they heard these other Christians were coming, they said, oh, whatever. They weren't really interested in it. So then the Christians start marching through Turkey, and they come to Nicaea, Nicea, which is very important in Catholic history because of the Nicene Creed. They took Nicaea easily because the Muslims weren't prepared. The Muslims weren't even there to defend it. When they finally got there, it was too late. So that was an easy victory. After that, nothing's going to be easy. So now they're marching through Turkey. This is a very arduous journey. It's very hot. It's desert territory. Oases are few and far between. Many of their animals died. But as one of the chroniclers of the crusade, first-person chronicler, this is a first-person source, he said, "But we who were diverse in languages, nevertheless seemed to be brothers in the love of God. If one lost any of his possessions, he who found it would keep it carefully until he found the loser and returned it. This is fit and proper for those who make the pilgrimage." So they regarded this as a pilgrimage. It wasn't a war, it was a pilgrimage. And their goal of the pilgrimage was the Holy Sepulchre. And so the hardships are part of a pilgrimage. You offer them up. And so that's what they did. Their first real battle was in Turkey. The Turks attacked Bohemond. The Christians were spread out. You can imagine the Crusaders are going to be kind of spread out. There's so many of them. So Turks attacked Bohemond, who they think we'll just attack him, then we'll do the next group, and then we'll divide and conquer. But Bohemond persuaded his men to hold fast while a messenger rode for Raymond. Messenger got to Raymond. Raymond rushed his men back. They got there in time, and the Christians won their first field engagement. After that, the Turks took them seriously. They finally reached the city of Antioch, which was once the third largest city in the Roman Empire, where the followers of Christ were called Christians for the first time, and where Peter had his first diocese before he moved on to Rome. The first substantial groups of Gentiles had converted to Christianity in Antioch. So it had a great Catholic history. It had enormous walls, and so the Christians, the Crusaders, had to do a siege. They had to surround it and try to batter the walls. This was not easy. They had not been able to bring with them the kind of siege engines like the catapults to batter the walls. This is before gunpowder. And it was difficult to supply their army. Well, it's not before gunpowder complete, but they didn't have those assets. And finally, Bishop Adhemar said, well, what we need is fasting and prayer. All right? You're trying to batter the walls down, and you're not getting anywhere. Try fasting and prayer. So they tried it, and it worked. A British fleet of Crusaders arrived with the siege engines. And then they were able to start battering the walls down. Bohemond found a traitor in Antioch. How he found him out exactly, I'm not sure. But he got the gates open, and the army came in. One of the first things they did was free the Catholic patriarch, the Catholic bishop, from the dungeon where he was being kept, and to purify and reconsecrate the cathedral. Then a Muslim relief force arrived, and the besiegers now became the besieged. So the Crusaders are in Antioch, but the Muslims are surrounding them. And here's another quote from the first-hand observer. Horse and donkey flesh was sold and eaten, because they've run out of food. They cooked and ate the leaves of the fig tree, grapevine, and thistle. Others cooked the dry hides of horses, camels, donkeys, cattle, or buffaloes. Such tribulation, famine, and fears we endured for 26 days. So for 26 days, they were besieged, and it reached the point where it was almost starvation. But finally, again, Bohemond takes the lead. He gathers together his men, and they go out of the city and attack the Muslim camp. The Muslims were never expecting it. If you're besieged, you think you stay in there and hunker down. They came out. It was a great victory for the Crusaders, and the Muslims are driven off, and Antioch is won. Now, everyone's exhausted, so they remain in Antioch for a while, recuperating. Adhemar, the bishop, dies of typhoid. This is important that he died because they now have no spiritual unifier. And the first really big controversy amongst the Crusaders arrived. Bohemond now begins to get a more worldly view. Instead of seeing this as a pilgrimage to get to the Holy Sepulchre, he says, I've conquered Antioch, it was my doing, which in large part it was. I think I'll just stay. I'll take the city. I'll stay here. Raymond and Godfrey said, no, we're on crusade. We have to go on. Bohemond said, no, I choose the city. Raymond and Godfrey said, I choose the crusade. And this is a sort of a theme you can see throughout history. Some people want the safe place where everything is now secure. Others are willing to take the risks to do what's right. Bohemond chooses a city, Raymond and Godfrey choose a crusade, and vast majority of the men went on the crusade. They did not stay in the city. So on January 18th, 1099, they begin their final march to Jerusalem. They reach Emmaus, which I think is like something like 7 to 9 miles outside of Jerusalem. They're not really sure of its exact location. They reach there, and a group of people from Bethlehem arrive in their camp. Bethlehem had remained a Christian city even throughout the Muslim conquest. They had held fast to their faith. It's still Christians in Bethlehem today, but fewer and fewer because the situation in the Holy Land is driving the Arab Christians, the Palestinian Christians out. There's no future for them there. But that's another story for another day. But our first-hand chronicler describes this. The Muslims came. I'm sorry, we'll start all over again. The Christians from Bethlehem came, and they asked some of the Crusaders to come with them back to Bethlehem. So this is what first-hand says. The following night, 100 of the truest soldiers mounted their horses and hastened all the way to Bethlehem. When the Christians found that the Crusaders had come, they were filled with great joy. When they had taken up their crosses and banners, they met the Christians with weeping and pious singing, because they knew those who had come would raise Christianity again to its proper honor. The Muslims now know that the Crusaders are going to get to Jerusalem. So when the Muslims know a group is coming of enemies, they know how to prepare the land. They know there's going to be a siege of Jerusalem. So what they do around Jerusalem, they poison the wells so that the enemy force cannot easily get water. They'd have to go a long way. And they scorch the earth, removing anything that would be edible for men or horses. So they'd have that already prepared. And they're waiting for the Christians to arrive. So the Christians arrive. The Muslims have plenty of water and food. The Christians are facing very great difficulties, not enough water, not enough food. Their first attack was on June 13. They suffered heavy losses, and they start quarreling. They're here within sight of the holy places, and they don't see any way to get in. Well, on July 6th, one of the Crusaders told the leaders that he had had a vision of Bishop Adhemar speaking to him. And Bishop Adhemar had said, quote, again from the first-hand source, "You who have come from the distant lands to worship God and the Lord of hosts, purge yourselves of your uncleanliness, and let each one turn from his evil ways. Then with bare feet march around Jerusalem invoking God, and you must also fast. If you do this, and then make a great attack on the city on the 9th day, it will be captured. If you do not, all the evils that you have suffered will be multiplied by the Lord." This vision reminded the Crusaders of why they were there. So they took it seriously. They did a march around the city with bare feet, fasting even more than they already were, and praying. This gave them the courage and the optimism they needed. They built huge siege towers, your towers you could roll up against the walls, and then the soldiers come out and jump over the walls or fight on the walls. They got these huge towers built up. The first one wasn't able to get a foothold, but then they tried another one, and finally one was getting very close and was ready to launch the assault over the walls. When one of the beams was cracking, Godfrey held it up himself until it could be fixed, and then the Muslims saw that the siege tower was being fixed, so then they dropped fire, blazing pitch onto the siege tower. The Christians put out the fire, and they finally get in. They open St. Stephen's Gate, and the Crusaders pour in. So the Muslims realize that they've lost. They retreat to try to get to some place where they can make a last stand. They can't. But then we have the worst moment of the First Crusade, and the one you've always heard of, and that's many of the Crusaders, having fought so long and so hard and so desperately, get in the city, and they lose control, and they begin to sack the city and kill innocent people, innocent Muslims. This is a big blight on what was an incredibly heroic venture. Godfrey and Raymond did not participate in the sack. They sheltered whatever Muslims they could, protected them, and tried to get the sack stopped. It finally died out, but it spoiled what was otherwise a beautiful victory. They finally calmed down, realized what they had done was very bad, and so finally, that evening, they did this, first-hand account. Toward evening, the leaders of the crusade, who only a week before had filed barefoot around the seemingly impregnable walls of the city, to the jeers of the Muslim defenders, walked in solemn state to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There they give thanks to God for their victory. It was well worth all our previous labors and hardships to see the devotion of the pilgrims at the Holy Sepulchre, how they rejoiced and exulted and sang a new song to the Lord. For their hearts offered prayers of praise to God, victorious and triumphant, which cannot be told in words. So the First Crusade had achieved its goals. They had regained control of the Holy Land, and they had established military superiority over the Muslims. At this point, most of the Muslims returned home. No, most of the Christians, most of the Crusaders returned home. They had achieved their goal. So one of the criticisms of the crusade is that they stayed on so they could have land. They wanted land, they stayed. Majority did not. Some did, but the majority did not stay. They went back home. The other thing is they wanted wealth. No, most of the crusaders had to raise the money to go on the crusade and almost put themselves into penury so they could do it, because it was expensive to go get your horse, get your weapons, get going. So they didn't get wealthy, the majority, and they didn't get land, the majority. They went back home feeling that they had done their work. They had done what God had wanted them to do. And so they returned home. Now, at this point, those that remain behind, they have to have some sort of government to replace the overthrown Muslims. They asked Raymond if he would be king of Jerusalem. Raymond said, "I will not wear a crown of thorns a crown of gold in the city where my Savior wore a crown of thorns." So he said, "No, thank you. I will not wear a crown of gold in the city where my Savior wore a crown of thorns." So then they asked Godfrey, and he said the same thing. How can you have a better line than that? "I will not wear a crown of gold in the city where my Savior wore a crown of thorns." But he said, "I will take a title of defender of the Holy Sepulchre. That's what I will be. I will not be a king. I will be defender of the Holy Sepulchre." Some of the crusaders that stayed behind formed themselves into what came to be known as the military orders. These were men who would take religious vows but be there for a military purpose, in this case, to defend the Holy Land in case Muslims launched a counterattack, and to protect pilgrims because there would be problems like bandits and things. So they had a military purpose, but they took religious vows, which is something unique in the history of Christendom. The most famous were the Knights of St. John, who not only did those two things that I mentioned, but they also are known as the Hospitallers because they set up hospitals, because pilgrims would come and they'd be sick or they'd get injured, and they had hospitals, some of the most modern, up-to-date hospitals that there were at the time. So the Holy Land is now under Catholic control, and Godfrey dies in 1100. Just a year later, his brother Baldwin did accept the crown of gold and became king of Jerusalem, so there was a series of kings in Jerusalem. Bohemond was captured by the Turks, and he also died in 1100, so he didn't have his city for very long. Raymond went to Syria and helped hold some land there for the Catholic cause. He died in 1106. So what do we see in the First Crusade? We see heroes suffering great hardships, persevering, fighting because they truly believed God willed it, and because they wanted to liberate the Holy Land from the enemies of Christ. We also see sinful human beings. We don't defend the sins, and we pray that the men repented. But we can still honor the heroism and understand that this was a just war with a noble purpose. Just as men today will fight and die for what is important to them, their families, their friends, their homelands, their freedoms, So the Crusaders fought for what was most important to them, the church and the honor and glory of God. So we're now going to go on and look at what happened after the First Crusade. So first, we'll look at the Second Crusade. Second Crusade. The Muslims had regained some of their land, so the Pope called for a Second Crusade. St. Bernard of Clairvaux preached it around Europe, and knights came from several different parts of Europe. This crusade had some problems from the beginning. For one, the King of France brought his vassals, his lords and noblemen, to fight with him. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a big landowner of herself. She was the second biggest landowner in France next to the king himself. And she decided, if her husband's going on crusade, and she's a landowner and a noble person, she should go on crusade. And if Eleanor's going on crusade, then the other wives feel that they should go on crusade too. Now, I hate to say this, but one of the reasons the Second Crusade failed was because all the women that came along. Besides that, the French and the German knights did not get along, and so the Second Crusade was a rather dismal failure. The only good thing that happened was that some knights from England wanted to join the crusade, so they were going to sail around the Iberian Peninsula into the Mediterranean and get there that way. But on the way, they said, wait, there are Muslims here. Why don't we fight them? We don't have to go to the Holy Land. So they liberated Portugal, and that was the only success of the Second Crusade. Third Crusade, by this time the Muslims had retaken Jerusalem, and Richard the Lionheart was the leader of the Third Crusade, trying to regain Jerusalem. He was a great cavalry commander. His opponent was a Muslim leader named Saladin, Saladin, who was also a great cavalry leader, and the two of the men actually had respect for each other. They fought a series of battles in the Holy Land, and Richard almost got to Jerusalem but couldn't quite make it. He couldn't quite get there to open up supply lines to get to Jerusalem. Furthermore, he got word from England that his brother, the wicked King John, yes, the King John of Robin Hood fame, the wicked King John was trying to take over his kingdom. He felt he owed a duty to his own people back in England. So for a variety of reasons, he decided he had to turn back. So he failed in taking Jerusalem. He gained a strip of land along the coast. And Saladin, because he respected Richard so much, allowed pilgrims to go to Jerusalem. So that at least was an accomplishment that Richard made from this treaty he made with Saladin. The Fourth Crusade was the worst atrocity. In 1204, the knights from different places in Europe had gotten as far as Constantinople. By this time, that whole crusading spirit has been lost. These knights were out more for wealth and power, and they weren't thinking about the honor and glory of God. They got to Constantinople, and they did not get along too well with the Christians of Constantinople, the Byzantines. Remember, the Byzantines were in schism, but they had so much in common. Nevertheless, they did not get along. The knights thought the Byzantines were just too weak and worldly, because a wealthy city. The Byzantines thought the knights were barbarians and uncivilized. They didn't even use forks after all, which the Byzantines were using. The knights used their fingers. But one of the Byzantine leaders said to the knights, if you help put me on the throne, I have a right to the throne. If you help put me on the throne, I will give you the money to complete your crusade. Because the knights had kind of run out of money. So the Byzantine emperor, the Byzantine emperor wannabe, said, I will help you get the money you need if you will just put me on the throne. And so the Crusaders said, of course, we'll do that. So they did. They put the Byzantine wannabe on the throne. And then he said, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't have all the money I thought I had. Can I just give you an IOU? Or the Crusaders then went wild and they sacked Constantinople. This is a Christian city. They sack it. They kill many innocent people. They steal lots of treasures. It was the worst atrocity of the entire history of the Crusades. They had lost their spiritual motivation. They had lost their crusading spirit, and so everything turned sour. And so eventually the Crusaders ruled Constantinople for a little while, and then they all went home. And this made it extremely difficult for there ever to be any reconciliation between Constantinople, the Byzantine church, and the Greek Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. And we still have a problem with that today. There were a few more crusades of not any consequence. The Turks rise up again. They conquered Constantinople in 1453. They start trying to move into the Balkans region. And then they decide to go to Italy and make Rome their goal. So the Muslims now are setting their sights on Catholic Europe. And so they move a huge army and a huge fleet, and they sail to Italy. They land at a place called Otranto, Otranto, 1480. In Otranto, there were about 400 soldiers. The Turks landed about 18,000 soldiers. The Turks always had a policy of asking the city they were about to attack, will you surrender? You surrender and everything will be fine. You don't surrender and things will be not fine. You'll be very sorry when we conquer you if you don't surrender first, peacefully. When they sent a messenger to ask for this surrender, he was met with a rain of arrows. So you know what their answer was. Unfortunately, many of the soldiers of those 400 were not native to Otranto. They'd been sent down by the king of Naples, and they figured they were going to get out while the getting was good. They left, and that left exactly 43 soldiers to defend Otranto. Of course, all the people rally. They know what will happen to them. In Constantinople, when it fell, many civilians had taken refuge in the big church, Hagia Sophia. When the Muslims broke in, they either killed every single person, including women, children, old people, or took them as slaves. There were no other options. They knew what would happen to them, so they helped out. The Muslims, when they would attack, the people would pour boiling water on them, boiling oil. They'd hurl rocks, statues, furniture, anything they had. They'd throw at them as they're attacking their walls. It was the people themselves fighting for their Catholic city. Finally, after 2 weeks, the Muslims broke in. They fought hand to hand. In Hagia Sophia, the civilians, the younger ones, the women, the older people crowded in. The Muslims came in and slaughtered them or took them as slaves. They captured 800 men that had been resisting them. And they took them out and they said, will you convert to Islam? Will you say there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet and deny Christ? One of the men spoke up for the group. He was a tailor, just an ordinary person, not a rich nobleman, not a bishop, just a tailor. They had already captured the bishop and immediately beheaded him. So they disposed of the bishop immediately. This man was named Antonio Primaldi, and he said to the Muslims, he says, we will never give up our faith. And then he turned to the men, the 800, and said, we have fought to save our lives. Now we must save our souls. We shall win eternal life and the glory of martyrs. The men cheered that they were willing to die 1,000 times for Jesus Christ. On August 14th, they were one by one brought forward and given the last chance to reject Christ. If he refused, the man was immediately beheaded. Next one, do you reject Christ? No. Beheaded. They went on through all 800. Every single one stood up for their faith. This group of 800 is the largest group of martyrs ever canonized. On May 12, 2013, Pope Francis canonized them, the martyrs of Otranto. But what they had done, by not giving in at the very beginning and saying, okay, we'll accept your peace terms, by holding them off for 2 whole weeks, it gave time for a defending force to be organized to come down and stop the Muslims and save Rome. So the martyrs of Otranto, besides winning eternal glory, they also saved Rome. So this is one of the God is goods, the 800 martyrs of Otranto. All right, also in the 1400s, we had the end of the Spanish attempt to regain their whole country. The Spanish attempt to regain their whole country from the Muslims, which had started in the year 722, was called the Reconquista, or reconquest. They fought off and on for 770 years. At this time, there's one Muslim kingdom left. It was the kingdom of Granada. The new king and queen of Spain are Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand. Queen Isabel was from Castile, Ferdinand was from Aragon, but their goal was to unite them and make one Spanish kingdom. And then they saw that we need to go after the Muslims. When Isabel came to the throne, perhaps the Muslims thought, oh, a woman on the throne, this should be easy. And so they had attacked and conquered one of her cities. So again, we see aggressive war. So Ferdinand and Isabel decided it was time to eliminate Muslim rule from Spain once and for all. Isabel raised the funds for the war. She recruited armies. She provisioned the troops. And she organized what were probably the first field hospitals in European history. She was a warrior queen, and she was very much involved. Ferdinand directed the armies and the strategy. It was a long, hard fight, but finally, on January 2nd, 1492, Isabel and Ferdinand entered the Muslim capital city, Granada, in triumph. Soon after, a man named Christopher Columbus, financed by Spain, reached the New World and opened up a hemisphere to Spanish colonization, civilization, and conversion. Spain became one of the greatest nations in the world and brought Christ to millions and millions of people. So, the Muslims said, what are 30 barbarians perched on a rock? They will inevitably perish. Pelayo said, this little mountain will be the salvation of Spain. So, who was right? Well, the Muslims don't give up on trying to take Christian Europe. They have a new sultan when we get to the 1500s. His name is Suleiman the Magnificent. And he first tried to take Vienna. Vienna, capital of Austria, was considered the gateway to Christian Europe. If you could take Vienna, then Christian Europe laid ahead of you. So he decides to march this huge army with cannons, which the Muslims now have, through Hungary, which they already conquered, to Vienna and open up Christian Europe. The people in Vienna start praying, and they pray very, very hard. They have a great devotion to the Blessed Mother, and as they're preparing all the defenses, they're praying. Suleiman gets into Hungary, and Hungary, of course, it was not well-paved roads. It was dirt roads, and not very good dirt roads. And it starts to rain, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains, and it's too muddy. He can't move his cannon at all. They're stuck in the mud. He tried to march his army to Vienna. They made a couple of minor attacks, failed completely, and he turned around and went back. So Christian Europe is saved. Now, that same century, Suleiman Magnificent decides to try to get to Rome. Okay, going that way through the land didn't work. Let's come around this way and go up through Italy. So first, we have to take Sicily, and before that, we have to take Malta. Malta is a tiny island about the size of Washington, D.C., and Suleiman was too old now to go. He was 71, and that's really old. And he doesn't go, but he sends his generals, and his general told him, I'll take that island in a week. That little island, it's a rock. I'll take that rock in a week. Well, on that island are the Knights of Jerusalem, the Knights of St. John, who had formed in the First Crusade, then had been driven out later by the Muslims. They're on Malta, and you have the Maltese, the civilians, and they know what happens to civilians when the Muslims attack. And so they had a fort called St. Elmo's, and then a fort called St. Angelo's. The leader of the Christian Knights was John Valette, and he was also 71. And so he says to the knights he puts in St. Elmo's, they're going to attack you first. You've got to hold out as long as you can. It doesn't matter how much it's going to cost you. You've got to hold that as long as you can. So Suleiman's general had said, I can take this island in a week. It took him 4 months. No, I'm sorry, it took him 2 months to take St. Elmo's. And then they try to take the next forts, and they fight for 2 months, and they fail. They cannot take the island. They withdraw on September 8th, which was the birthday of the Blessed Mother. The Knights and the people of Malta had a great devotion to the Blessed Mother, and they still do. And they said, Blessed Mother saved us. The Muslims pulled out on her birthday, September 8th. So Malta was saved, Sicily was saved, and Italy was saved. Suleiman was furious when they came back and told him. He said, I guess I have to do it myself. So he went out and joined his army again, but he died on campaign, and so that got nowhere. Well, I got one more story I need to tell. And that was still in the 1500s, and that's Suleiman's son, Selim the Grim, who decides, I will take Rome. We'll stable our horses in St. Peter's in Rome. So the Christians, as usual, were not getting along. They were quarreling over this and that. The Muslims landed on the island of Cyprus, and after a long, hard fight that took several weeks, they took Cyprus. They captured the fighting men and their leader who had defended Cyprus. They said, we will let you go free. You can get on these ships and you can sail away safely, and we'll just take over. Oh, and we promise that we won't kill civilians. So that's one of the reasons why the Christian decided he had to surrender, because the situation was so bad for the civilians. Well, you can probably guess how much that promise was worth. When the soldiers marched out, they were immediately attacked. The general was captured. The Muslims later massacred or enslaved the people, as they always did. They captured the leader, and they brutally tortured him, humiliated him, and finally ended up skinning him alive. When the knights of different leaders of Europe found out that this had happened on Cyprus, they said, we need to get together. And so they heeded the Pope's call for a crusade to stop the Muslims from getting to Italy. The Pope was Pope Pius V, who was a saint, and he united the people of Europe in a holy league, and it was under the command of a Spanish prince named Don Juan of Austria. So they sail out a fleet to meet the Muslim fleet. The one was coming from Cyprus to try to get to Italy. So the Catholic fleet is coming, the Muslim fleet is coming. The Pope asked all the people of Europe to pray the rosary for the success of this new crusade. And so all over Europe, Catholics were praying the rosary. Don Juan gave all of his men and all of his ships each a rosary. The night before the battle, the chaplains on the ships heard confessions. The morning of the battle, the wind was blowing behind the Turks, which gave them a great advantage. Even though the ships were rowed at this time, it still, sails would be helped. They had sails that were helped by a wind behind them. The wind was sailing behind them. All of a sudden, it shifted and now was behind the Catholic fleet. So I bet a lot of rosaries were going on at that exact moment. The Turks sailed in a form of a crescent, which is a Turkish symbol. Don Juan had his ships in the form of a cross, sailing toward the Turkish crescent. It was a very hard-fought battle, but Don Juan fought heroically. Many of the other men fought heroically as well. And in the end, the Turkish fleet was destroyed. It was absolutely destroyed. Almost every ship was either damaged or sunk or captured. It was an incredible victory for the Catholics. And it saved Christian Europe. The Turks never again attacked by sea. They'd lost their fleet. The Pope learned of the victory by a vision. The very moment the victory was going on, he saw it in a vision. So when a messenger finally got to him from Don Juan saying, we won, the Pope said, yeah, I know. The Pope declared a feast day. Its original name was Our Lady of Victories. Now it's called Our Lady of the Rosary, October 7th, which was the actual day of the battle, October 7th, 1571. So now we see a new rebirth of militant Islam. They're again talking about flying the Islamic flag in the Vatican. So we need to be militant as well, praying to Our Lady of Victories. And we can be inspired by the examples of Pelayo and his men at Covadonga, the first crusaders persevering through overwhelming hardships, the martyrs of Otranto, Little Malta, Don Juan of Lepanto, and all the rest. We should be spiritual crusaders, standing always for the truth and encouraging our children to imitate the heroes of our Catholic history. Thank you. More questions? Again, ones that are more general, I'm saving for after, and these are three that are directly related. Can you give us the numbers of the Christians and the Muslims in the Battle of Lepanto? Now, most of the land battles, like on Malta and at Otranto and places like that, the Muslims had way more people than the Christian defenders. But at Lepanto, the number of ships was roughly equal between the two fleets. So it wasn't so much a case of being outnumbered. It was a matter of how the fight was going to go. I should have mentioned this, that after the Battle of Lepanto and the victory was won, the Catholics freed the galley slaves that were the rowers of the Turkish ships, most of whom were captive Christians who were forced to serve on the Turkish galleys. And they freed 10,000 prisoners from those ships. So it's 10,000 Catholics that had been imprisoned. And on the ships that the Turks had, they normally had their galley slaves chained to the benches, so if the ship went down, they went with them. So the Christians had to get on those ships pretty fast to free those. Whereas on the Christian ships, they had people rowing, and some of whom were criminals, were serving off a sentence and things like that. But they did not chain them to the benches, so they had as much a chance. So that's what I know about that. In terms of the number of men on the ships, I don't have that figure. Might you give to us a quick response to those who attack the church on issues like the Crusades? How do we respond charitably and quickly when attacked? What accessible resources do we point others to? Over there is a book called The 7 Myths of Something by Diane Moxar, and she has several of the things we've already talked about, like the Spanish Inquisition and like the Crusades. She's got a very good, very readable, very well written, very well argued answers. And the reason I would specifically say to look at her book is that at the end she has a chapter, or maybe it's an afterword, on how you deal just in general with lies of people that just don't know any better. And the idea of charitably is very important. You don't get anywhere if you start saying, oh, that's stupid, how could you believe such a thing? That's not going to win any friends. She recommends first try to find something you can have in common, some agreement that you can find somewhere in this issue. And then having started with something you can agree on, so that they realize you're just not out going to attacking them, but you want to argue for the truth. Then you start presenting some facts and the specifics that are different from what they think. You can even ask them, what are your sources for this? Where do you get your information? And they probably will say, Google, or, I learned something about this in high school, or somebody told me this. Usually they have no factual basis. And that way, if you can present them, well, here's some facts that are historical facts. You can look them up, they're confirmed, and present some of that to get them thinking along other lines. And to see, sometimes you can find even contradictions in some of the things they say, and gently, why don't you think about this a little bit more? This might be different. So just get them to think about some facts that you can present that are pretty certain. And again, all the books on that table are going to be helpful to you. And there's one book that I put on the reading list that I put out that I only had the one copy, and so I didn't want to bring it because I didn't want to lose it. But it's on that reading list that I printed up, and I presume we still have copies of that lying around. And that's a book that has many of these issues, including other ones, many more things the church is attacked on, including moral issues. And it's got a few very short essays on each issue, very factual, very well argued, and then resources. So I would suggest, if you really want to get into this whole apologetics thing, that you start doing your reading, start looking what issues do you feel you couldn't defend too well, and then get do some of the reading on that. And then you'll have in your mind different facts. And when you're reading, I strongly suggest taking notes and underlining and highlighting, which I don't think you can do with a Kindle, so you might have to get real books. But and make sure you have they're reliable books. I mean, I wouldn't rely too much on Wikipedia for my facts. Yes. Well, I don't have it in my head. Could you have the read? No, it's not on the table. Well, first that one. 7 Lies? Yes, 7 Lies, and then the Rodney Stark book. Those are two excellent ones. But do you have the reading list over there that you could get me? I can read the other one. Oh, here it is. It was just found by my cohort here. The name of the book is Catholic Controversies, Understanding Church Teaching and Events in History, and it's by Stephen Gabriel, edited, and he's got all of the experts on each issue. And I couldn't find it on Amazon, but there is a website and an address which I put on this reading list. So Catholic Controversies, Understanding Church Teachings and Events in History by Stephen Gabriel, edited. So that was excellent. That's just quick things that you could even, if you have a friend that's gotten kind of interested and maybe is going to listen, maybe photocopy just a few pages and say, why don't you look at this and think about it, and then we can meet again and talk about it some more. And if you can point out some of these factual things when he can't really support anything he has to say with facts, then I think you'll make progress. And of course, when it's something that needs to be admitted, like something that was done wrong, then it's fine that the members of the church did. We need to admit that. Don't be just totally on the defensive. Oh my, no, we never did such things. No, we tell the truth. Truth is always important. Truth exists. So that's what I think is the best thing to do with that. Do some research, get some ideas on each issue that you think you might come up with, and always find, if possible, something you can agree on, and then present the opposite view with specific facts. Ask them what kind of facts and research they have to support what they said. What are the names and dates of the major battles in the history of Christianity and Islam? I thought this person was just going to say the history of Christianity, was trying to be funny to see if I could answer that. But no, the person went on and said, and Islam. The ones we should know best for apologetics. All right, just to give you a quick rundown. What I want to show, the most important ones, are the ones that show Islam on the attack. That almost all of our efforts, of Catholic efforts, were defensive, not offensive. The Turks, or the Muslims before the Turks, the Arabs, were the aggressors. So start with Muhammad, starting about 635 or so. Well, Muhammad started in 632, and he conquered all of Arabia. He didn't go any farther than Arabia. But then after that, we get to Omar, the one who really said, I'm going to wipe out all Christians and make it just the abode of Islam. Starting around, say, 640, and then you just go through. There's a whole bunch of battles, and I could name all of them, but just these great Arab conquests, the battles that they won from 640 to 732 when the conquest stopped, when they were stopped in France at the Battle of Tours, Tours. So they won battles like they were called Battle of Qadisiyah and Battle of Nehaward, and these are ones that nobody would really ever remember. But just say during that period, that decade, or that century rather, it was the Muslims were on the aggressive the whole time, and they conquered the Middle East. They conquered Spain. They went as far as India, to point out that they were definitely on the aggression. I would certainly encourage knowing about the Battle of Covadonga, 722, when Palau and his men withstood the Muslim assault to complete their conquest of Spain. Some might say, well, that's just a little piece that they saved. But that was the foundation of a 770 years long war, inspiring the Christians to continue the fight till they won their country back. The Christians at Covadonga swore an oath they would not give up. They would keep fighting no matter what. And that spirit continued all throughout Spanish history. All right, and then I would jump down to 1071, and that was a battle called Manzikert, which I briefly mentioned, Manzikert. It was in Armenia, which the Byzantine Empire ruled. This was the one where the emperor was killed, and that led to the Byzantines requesting help from the West, which led to the First Crusade. Again, this aggression, Seljuk Turks are trying to conquer all of the Byzantine Empire. And then the First Crusade fought in Jerusalem in 1099, the main battle of the First Crusade, in which the Muslims were finally driven out of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was taken for the church. And then to come into the somewhat more modern times, so that was the 1000s. Then we come to, 1480, Battle of Otranto, to show how the Muslims treated people, and to show that it was, again, aggressive and total warfare because women and children could be killed. Before that, chronological order, 1453 was the fall of Constantinople, when the whole Byzantine Empire was gone. Eastern Christianity was totally swallowed up by Islam. And again, the number of people that were massacred in that. 1565 was Malta, the Battle of Malta, a great story of heroism, how the Catholics defended their little island against a massive, overwhelming force of Muslims. I wish I have time to tell the whole story, but that would take me a whole class. But there's so many wonderful stories in that story. Then Lepanto was 1571, when it ended completely. Turkish sea power. One I didn't have time was 1683, I think that's right, close enough. The Siege of Vienna, when the Muslims were again trying to take Vienna, the gateway to Christian Europe. And again, the Christians in Vienna were outnumbered. And again, they prayed. And this time, the rescue came from a Polish king named Jan, Jan Sobieski, Sobieski, who brought a relief force, who relieved the siege of Vienna and helped win the day. And before he came, he brought his army, he stopped at the shrine of Our Lady of Czestochowa, the great patroness of Poland, Our Lady, Queen of Poland. And he stopped there to pray, just like John Paul the Great stopped there every time he went to Poland. So again, we see Our Lady's involvement in so many of these different battles. So I would think those are the main ones that show militant Islam. In the 1700s, Islam was very much on a decline again. And then now, of course, the radicals are starting again. So that's what I want to say about that. And I guess I'll do this other one real fast, because it is kind of related. And that is, what about the Inquisition and St. Ignatius of Loyola? St. Ignatius of Loyola, after his conversion, he had led a pretty wild life, and he was converted and became a soldier of Christ. And he went back to university because he'd never done well in school, wasn't interested in education, he was just interested in militancy and fighting people. Went back to school, and he would, when he was studying at different universities, he would go out and start teaching. As he learned new things, he wanted to teach them, and he would teach them. And the Inquisition was suspicious. What is this lay person? You know, he's not a priest, and he hasn't even finished his degrees. And so they were a little worried that he might be teaching heresy. So they brought him before the Inquisition. That was his job. They investigated and found that he knew what he was talking about. And so they let him go. Teresa of Avila was once brought before the Inquisition, too, because some of the things she was writing in her mystical theology books. But she was let go. So those are the questions that we have